Rad Lads podcast. This is Gabriel.
This is Samuel.
And we have a guest today is Dr. Tim Richardson.
Tim is the author of Contingency, Imminence, and the Subject of Rhetoric. He's an associate professor of English at UTA here. Teaches courses in antique and contemporary rhetoric, psychoanalytic theory, media studies, and writing.
So, welcome.
Thank you.
What we've talked in the past about, you're doing some work on science fiction and fantasy and what makes science fiction as opposed to what makes fantasy what it is. We were hoping maybe we could start with that.
Sure. These are still preliminary thoughts, right? So I don't want to be held to them completely. But what I'm thinking is that the hallmark of fantasy, I think, is world building, right? That fantasy really is invested in building as detailed and as convincing a world as possible, right? And I guess my question is why? What does it get from that? One answer is that you get sequels so that you can build a franchise, possibly across books and film and television and comics and whatever else, right? So it's a way of proliferating but also delaying an end, where the kind of science fiction I'm interested in is maybe better called speculative fiction. And I think what that kind of fiction tries to do is demonstrate, I'm not even sure how to say this right now, an impasse or a gap or some problem that can't be addressed directly. And that I think fantasy is trying to avoid or cover over. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you are equating fantasy as a genre in some ways with fantasy as it would be talked about in psychoanalytic terms.
Yeah, I think so. Insofar as the work of fantasy is building a sense of completeness, of wholeness, that everything's taken care of. Yeah. And I think that's, I think fans of this means that some science fiction is really science fantasy, right?
Okay, so I was going to ask about that. So regardless of classifying something as, because we have this discussion sometimes about something as being hard sci-fi or
right.
space fantasy.
Yeah.
Regardless of that, I was thinking, what you're talking about, immersive world building in like multi-stage series. You have something like The Expanse.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's exactly what that is. It just takes place in space.
Right.
Even if there's no other quote-unquote fantasy elements like magic.
Right, yeah. I think The Expanse is, the TV show, is a good example of, well, it's more like a political thriller, right, in terms of genre, but it's still sort of participating in that fantastic element, this sort of endless world, and it's why there's so many characters. Right, is so that you can keep the story going even if someone dies, so that people or characters end up being useful for the story, but not necessarily the cause of the story.
Okay.
Right, so they tend not to be character driven, I guess is my point.
So that the world is still immersive, whereas like if it was character driven and you had a character that was killed off, then it hampers how much you can participate in it.
Right. Yeah, I think so. I mean, if it's your main character, it's your way into the world. Yeah. Once that character's gone, then the show's over, right? Or you have to do something very, very different. And some series have done that, I think.
So are you making a connection then between sort of fantasy's impulse to expand and keep things going with television as a genre?
Until recently, yeah. I mean, I think limited series, especially in British series that would run for what we would call a season, right, and then end, or one or two, and we're getting more of those, right? The Leftovers is 3, I think, and done, right? Lost, I think everyone agrees, went on too long, until they found their end. But those shows that are introduced with an end in sight, I think, aren't even. I mean, in some ways, that's the only non-fantasy element of Game of Thrones, right?
Is that it has an end game?
Yeah, that there seems to be an end to it, except that the studios HBO's invested in. Well, now we'll have prequels and spinoffs and everything else because we have to keep it going, right? And so it's clearly sort of registering that way, at least for audiences.
The funny thing about that is that George R. Martin is no longer even putting his priority on the book.
Right.
He's prioritizing the television show, which he's a part of. So the whole idea of them having an end game based on a series of books that is no longer the end,
right?
Is I don't know. It's kind of
and I think that's another reason why it's really easily translatable in the sense that world building's world building, and it's all about detail. And so you want to give as much detail as you can, and you can do that in print or you can do that in images. Mad Max Fury Road is, I think, a fantastic fantasy film, right? Because it's so much about world building, so much about the smallest, most intimate detail you see those guys on the stilts in the swamp, and we see them for 3 seconds. I want to know so much more about those people, right? I mean, it's so evocative. Or, the people eater and the bullet farmer, and I mean, they're titles. They're not even names, but their costumes are so particular that you sense a whole backstory there that could be explored in various ways. And so, I mean, it's a way of, there's so much to deal with that you don't have to think about what they can't deal with, what they can't say. It's a way of giving so much that you don't notice what can't be shown.
So can the post-apocalyptic kind of bridge that threshold? Meaning, it kind of, I mean, it's all about the post-apocalyptic is all about immersive world building, and yet at the same time, it's about talking around a subject that we otherwise couldn't really talk about.
Yeah, or
I mean, it's like more of a genre. Like when you just, if you like approach something that is post-apocalyptic, do you tend to? Is your gut reaction like that's fantasy or that's sci-fi?
My gut reaction is that that's fantasy. Okay. Right? That insofar as it's making something that we don't want to talk about something that we can talk about. It's, the idea is that, sex has gotten really complicated. Politics has gotten really complicated. The environment has gotten really complicated. So let's simplify it. Let's just, turn the world off and turn it back on again to reset everything so that men are men and women are women and good is good and evil is evil, and the environment is either something that we're constantly fighting against or something that's fighting for us. You just need to... I keep waiting for a live action, huge sort of Hollywood spectacle of Thundar the Barbarian, because it's the movie that's set in the future that combines technology and magic, because they might as well be the same thing, right? In a post-apocalyptic wasteland. I think that's the next thing. That's what will end the genre. I'm hoping, because I really want to see it. No, not that I'm hoping the genre ends, but that's something I've wanted to see since I was really little.
So what would be some examples then on the side of science fiction that deal directly with the thing that fantasy is avoiding?
Weirdly, so right now I'm thinking, and again, this is all provisional, but right now I'm thinking it's the dystopian science fiction. Okay. Not always, right? Because I think the Hunger Games and the other one that was a film series, Divergent, Insurgent, those films, right? Those are kind of still participating in the sort of fantasy thing, but Brazil comes to mind, right? Because it's so much about bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is another way of covering over lack or covering over, and that's its topic in a way. I think, in some ways I would have said Blade Runner, but now there's a sequel, so we'll have to see. But I think anytime that they announce a sequel and you go, oh no, it's a film that's not really demanding a sequel. probably Ex Machina would be one of those, because it's, I think, my reading is that it's a film about masculine fantasy, right? That it's a film that has no women in it, that instead has masculine fantasy sort of realized. I'm trying to think of others.
Well, since you brought up Brazil, can I ask you a question about, and you brought up bureaucracy, does that participate, you think, more in the imaginary order? And I'm thinking as a way that just continually pushes like the mimesis, both like the uniforms and then the office. You're going desk by desk, and even the quirky things aren't quirky anymore. They're stylistic, but they're not unique. It's just everything's kind of weird and strange, but everything's weird and strange.
Right.
Masses of paper and everything. And I guess just bureaucracy in general, but particularly in Brazil, does it participate that way? You think?
Yeah. I mean, I think that. Yeah, I mean, certainly you could talk about the sort of intersection of the symbolic and the imaginary, so that the kind of workaday imaginary work, I guess, that we do, you're pushing it off to someone else or to paper, to filing cabinets, some sort of symbolic other that then takes care of what's supposed to be taken care of, but nothing ever is, right? I mean, that's the worst thing you can possibly do is actually fix someone's air conditioning in that movie, right? So yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I think there's a kind of confusion of the imaginary and the symbolic that I think is really interesting, because then all you're left with are these sort of fantasy elements that stand in for the real, and the fantasy elements are also just products of the symbolic.
So does the dead fly, does that become the thing that kind of creates a disruption in that?
Yeah, some sort of anamorphic distortion or some stain, right, that then changes everything. And it's also contingent, right? I mean, there's nothing necessary about it. It just happens, and then there are repercussions.
It's also unique that it's not like the thing in some unique, horrible sense.
Right.
It's a fly.
Yeah.
It's a fly was just a fly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways, it's both like and completely the opposite of that in the second Matrix film, that systemic anomaly, because it's just an anomaly. It's not even, right, there's no reason for it. It just happens, and there are repercussions that are major for one character, but not so major for the world. Maybe, I mean, the movie or the TV series that I always link with it is Max Headroom, right? Which is also, it's dystopic. It takes place 15 minutes in the future, I think is what they say, right? And weirdly, it's a TV series that began and was intended to be episodic, but clearly couldn't last very long because of the nature, its premise and the way it worked through. I think it had its own end built into it. It ended up being canceled eventually because the stories were about to get repetitive. It just did what it could do.
It's not a early MTV too, right?
Well, I mean, it was a British. The original pilot was British.
Oh, okay.
And then it was on network television.
Was it?
Yeah, surprisingly. And I can't remember if it was NBC or. I mean, I want to say it's NBC, but I haven't sort of looked back at it except for that original pilot since it aired, really. But yeah, Blank Reg is a kind of hero of mine, I think.
So, a couple of the classes that you taught, I think we were both in Futures of Sin, Sam, right? Yeah. Have a kind of speculative quality to them, and you talked about doing a sound studies class in the future, and then also returning to a kind of rhetoric of the futures class. Do you see those as a kind of science fiction or a genre of science fiction?
Yeah, in these terms, right? In these terms I'm thinking about, and in some ways maybe the reason I've been thinking about speculative fiction versus fantasy is just as an excuse to teach these classes that I want to teach. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in sort of the ways we talk about the future. If science fiction is really about the present, right, which is I think a pretty that's a commonplace. The ways we talk about the future are certainly indications of what we're concerned with right now. They're not predictive, right? You're not trying to predict the future. Instead, you're sort of playing out scenarios. You're speculating, right, on what it would mean to do something right now. So they're deliberative and sort of deliberative rhetoric, but I think also epidictic rhetoric. I mean, they're commentaries, praise and blame, in the strict Aristotelian sense. So I'm wondering about what are ways that we can sort of provoke the future, right? Or what I guess maybe what Stephen Shabiro calls the futurity of the present, right? Or what Warren Ellis calls our science fiction condition, the things that are with us right now that really belong to the future. Like my favorite slide, one of my favorite slides I ever put together was to talk about, where's our jetpack, right? Mm-hmm. The future we were promised had jetpacks and that sort of thing. And then the slide was of this little pack from, I want to say, Verizon maybe, that was called the jetpack, and it's for cellular connection on the go. So it was a hotspot for your laptop or whatever, so that you could work from anywhere in the world. And so in some ways the answer is, here's your jetpack. You don't have to go anywhere to work, right? Yeah. And so we just don't notice the jetpacks that we have.
Because it's not that jetpack
right.
that we were promised.
Right, exactly. And so the future comes when we're not expecting it, and in ways that we don't expect it. And I mean, it's William Gibson's commonplace that the future's already here, is just not evenly distributed, is I think exactly the point. I mean, it's a commonplace for a reason.
Well, it's like the idea of we don't have flying cars, but air travel has become so convenient from even 30 years ago. Well, I mean, in a lot of ways. Obviously, not talking about the pain in the ass of security and everything.
Right.
Generally, you can fly pretty cheap and pretty quickly to anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think even more, you don't have to. You can just Skype. Right?
Just alleviating.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it. I think, increasingly, and I think appropriately, for instance, for our job market, interviews are being held less and less at the MLA convention, and instead via Skype, I think, because it's cheap and it doesn't force people who don't have jobs, for the most part, to spend a bunch of money to fly someplace just in order to maybe sort of be in the running for a job. Skype makes sense for that. Telecommunicating or telecommuting, I guess is the word, from home. A lot of us work from home. I mean, those days I'm not teaching, I'm still working. I'm just at home working instead of in the office.
Well, it seems like there's certainly a dystopic aspect of that insofar as it just allows everywhere to be your work.
That's the problem. That's exactly the problem.
There's no excuse to be out of the office.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what then plays into the kind of capitalism that universities have started being. But yeah, business in general, right? I mean, you're always on the clock. You're supposed to always be available. One of the things I've started doing is, I'm old enough to remember that when I needed to talk to my professor, I went to her office hours. If I was in class normally during her office hours, I had to make a choice. Do I miss class and go to her office hours, or do I not get to talk to her? Emails made everyone really, really available potentially, but for undergraduate classes or courses, I've started putting on my syllabus that I only respond to student email during my scheduled office hours. This opens it up. They can email me whenever they need to, right? They don't have to miss class in order to meet with me, but they shouldn't expect me to respond at 3:00 in the morning the day before something's due, or on the weekend when I'm spending time with my kids or my family. I think that's a fair sort of splitting of it. But yeah, I mean, that's a big problem.
So where do your interest in sound studies intersect with this, or do they? Or is that just another tangent that you're able to include in some of these classes?
I haven't done all that work yet of folding everything together, but I mean, I could speculate.
Sure.
Right. I think outside of podcasts and sort of narrative work, soundscapes, and sort of the practice of, sort of evoking the practice of acousmatic listening, and it's a way of staging a place or a space.
Like an installation?
Yeah, that's not necessarily narrative. And so it can evoke without having to say in ways that it's difficult to do in print or even sometimes in an image, right? It's a time-based medium that, because of its nature, is sort of ephemeral. You hear it and it's gone, but also doesn't necessarily have to be prescriptive. It doesn't have to or descriptive, maybe, if that makes sense. So that, yeah, I mean, it's a way of staging something that you wouldn't be able to stage otherwise. Something that would be, a place that would be sort of prohibitively expensive to build, right? Or a scene that would be too expensive to stage in person. It's also portable now in ways that it hadn't been before, right? Digital technology makes it infinitely copyable and portable, and distributable for almost free. But it's also, in some ways, participating in sort of classical, sort of rhetorical ideas of speech without necessarily having to indulge in words. I don't know.
Seems interesting when you compare like the ubiquity of digital recording and playback to the description of certain places that cannot be digitized. Like when people say they go like a particular space, like a cathedral, and one way that people describe it, like in a touristy kind of way, is that like you walk in there and you can hear somebody whisper from across the room, and they describe the acoustics of a place that really kind of connects you to it in a really kind of interesting way, but you cannot reproduce it digitally. So I wonder if there's some kind of architectural rhetorical move there.
I don't know that you can't, though. I mean, the other thing about sound is it's really intimate, right? So I don't know that sound designers couldn't create something like that, if not that in particular. Sound designers are much more talented and learned than I am, but certainly there are ways of recording spaces or creating sort of imaginary spaces or fake spaces that at least orally sound convincing. Right? So maybe I'm actually arguing against myself. Maybe what I'm after is a kind of fantasy of that's generated through sound. So maybe the sound stuff is a way of staging fantasy. I'm not sure. I hadn't thought about that until just now. I guess the only thing I would say is that because it's time-based, it feels like you have to let things go in ways that you don't have to in print or in image.
Okay.
Right? Stupid example, but I have a hard time reading novels for fun anymore because I feel like I need to be writing with a pen in my hand and I need to be annotating.
Yeah.
And because that's what I've done for decades at this point. And so I always feel like it's work, even when I'm supposed to be doing it for fun. The only way that I can let that go is by listening to books, because then it's not easy for me to annotate, at least. And usually the occasions I'm listening, I'm driving or I'm doing housework or I'm mowing the lawn or something like that. So it doesn't lend itself to taking notes. And so I have to just enjoy and let things go. and I think that's easier with sound. And so that's how I've rediscovered fiction is through audiobooks.
You've also done a lot of field recording, right?
Mm-hmm.
For creating music too. You've seen Upstream Color?
Sure.
So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that in the way, the application of, because you do field recording and you make music and sound, right?
Yeah, music. You can't see my scare quotes, but yeah.
I mean, I'd consider it music. I mean, like you said, it's based on time and it's a particular experience, and I think those are really the only two coordinates you need.
I made a recent piece. A musician said that, and he meant this as a compliment, that it was the most unmusical thing he'd ever heard. But yeah, I was pretty proud of that.
Pure experience.
Yeah. There was nothing musical at all about it, and that's pretty much all I can aim for. I'm not terribly musical.
Well, I was gonna. There's this really interesting scene in Upstream Color. Have you seen?
No,
Upstream? You haven't. So this guy collects sounds, but early on in the movie, he sets up this kind of perimeter and puts speakers down in the ground. And this woman, she's one of the main characters. She's basically been infected with this parasite, and the whole point of these speakers on the ground is to and it's almost like a heartbeat kind of droning in and out sound, and it draws her to it, and then he ends up using it to withdraw this giant tapeworm kind of thing out of her. Right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think it brings worms up from the ground, right? And then it does cut to a scene where he's wrapping this worm around something and it's pulling out of her. So they're related. I can't remember exactly. Yeah.
I was just curious what you thought about that, kind of taking sound and field recording and going beyond music, and it's using it almost like a narrative palette, but not in a way that's like art or external soundtrack work. It's actually doing narrative work.
Yeah, I mean, that film's I think a great example. The sound design in that, I have no idea what the movie's about, but I've seen it a couple of times just because the sound design is amazing. All what would normally be incidental sounds are sort of pushed to the front, and sometimes it's hard to hear dialogue because the other sounds but there's a whole sequence where that recorder, the collector's out recording and collecting sounds, and then those sounds are sort of mimicked or kind of reproduced with other characters doing work, right? And so you start to see a kind of you see a connection of the scenes through sounds, not through action, right? So that organizing principle becomes really important, I think, throughout the film. But it's not one that's obvious. It's not one that you sort of expect in a film, and so it's off-putting in I think all the right ways. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I was asking because it seems like one of the overarching themes of what we've been doing with this podcast is talking about Boyarin's heresiology, and how heresy can define an orthodoxy. But I jumped on this talking about sound study stuff because I think that he does that really interestingly, that using sound in a way that, it's not soundtrack work, it's not just sound effects either. I mean, it's the focal point. Like when you see him striking an object and recording it, and you are experiencing it with the character, I don't know, there's something participatory in that sound making that is a lot of other films don't really do. And so I was just wondering if that was a kind of, I don't know. I don't know if it really helps cement the idea of other kinds of sound or not. I don't know what kind of work it does, but it really makes me think that it's something that crosses a kind of boundary.
Yeah, I mean, it
does.
That's
why it's uncomfortable.
Right. I mean, it certainly it messes with expectations as far as film goes, and so does let you know that you're participating in something in a way that you wouldn't normally participate with. there's a long tradition in music of that, right? I mean, obvious examples would be, Sadi's furniture music, which is, how about music that's supposed to be in the background, right? That isn't intrusive, even though people started listening to it as if, and paying attention to it in ways that he didn't want them to sometimes. Or, Webern and Schoenberg and the 12-tone stuff that they introduced, which was just a different scale, right? And a different sort of way of engaging with traditional instruments usually. Or John Cage, who said any kind of sound, right?
Or no sound.
Yeah, or no sound. The thing is, I think what's important about that piece, the 433, right, is that it's not about no sound. I mean, what in a performance of that, what you start to hear is people sort of shifting uncomfortably in their seats, or sneezing, or whatever. You start treating all of the sounds that you would never pay attention to as they're in the occasion that would normally be set aside for music, and so you start paying attention to them in ways that you wouldn't otherwise. But then also, but then the whole tradition of musique concrète, right, which was taking field recordings and sounds that would normally not be considered musical, and then treating them in a way, right? So stretching them or splicing them or doing something with them, editing them together to make music, right? Certainly participates in that. And then sort of the American version of that would be tape music, right? That then taking recorded sounds and cutting those up and treating the sounds, well, the material, right, that records the sound as a kind of instrument, which sort of you find in Brian Eno's later insistence that the studio is an instrument, right? And
so like hearing the pops and the crackles and of like a record spinning.
Yeah, but even more. I mean, something like not Burial, the Caretaker is a musician who
he's gonna wound the tape.
Well, no, I mean that's more BBC Radiophonic Workshop stuff, right? The stretching the tape around the room and sort of moving, trying to find new sounds that way. The Caretaker is someone who's alive right now and is producing music, and one of the things he does is take old 78s, sometimes recognizable pieces, and then he surfaces the cracks and the sort of the pops, the sort of material remnants, right, of the medium itself, and then pushes the what would normally be the music, the stuff that you're after, into the background and sort of blurs it, and so that you're experiencing kind of the materiality of the work over what would normally be digitized and cleaned up. I don't know. I haven't.
In some ways, parallels Bowie's Black Star.
Yeah. I think so.
That dramatizing or making art out of his own death.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way of dealing with it. Dealing with dying, right? You don't deal with death. Death is something that just happens, right? But I guess it's a way of. Yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine. I don't want to be in that situation and imagine it, but I do appreciate it because it does seem like I don't want to say ethical way of dealing with it or working through it, but I think it's certainly brave. If nothing else. But it's also, I mean, it can be a way of commenting on your other work, right? But I don't think Bowie did that. I think that's what's interesting about that album is that he's working with musicians he's never worked with before, at least popularly, right? He's working with a jazz group that...
I think he just found him
in
some bar.
Right. And so, I mean, there's something really, I think, beautiful about introducing... your last thing is introducing a group of musicians you really respect to the world, right? But
although I interpreted some of those music videos, so there's, I think it was, I forget which one it was. Maybe it was Lazarus. Maybe it was a different one. There's these aliens that come upon a spacesuit,
right? Which
I interpreted as Major Tom.
Sure. Yeah,
but maybe that was just purely in the music video aspect of it.
Maybe, yeah, and maybe also in the song, because I mean he he's someone who's mattered to us for a very long time. Many of us anyway. And so you wouldn't want him to not acknowledge that he's mattered to us.
Right.
Right? You appreciate those gestures. And I think it can be both and, right? I mean, it can be both something that's new, that's offering something new, and also something that you're saying thank you in some way, right? Or at least we get to say thank you. I don't know how that works.
So you've mentioned a couple times that your favorite Bowie albums are the ones he did with Eno.
Yeah.
And I've always been inclined to really like the Ziggy Diamond Dogs kind of stuff.
Oh, I love that stuff too.
I'm curious what is it about the Bowie Eno connection that really speaks to you there?
Mostly it's because I love Brian Eno, right? And as a producer, I have to admit that I like least the stuff he did with U2, right? I mean, my least favorite U2 work is the stuff that Eno did with them. So I don't always love him as a producer, I guess is the point. One of the most famous songs Bowie ever sort of produced is Heroes, right? Everyone knows that song. I think what's great about that song is that they're making it near the Berlin Wall in a crappy little studio, right, in West Berlin. They hadn't figured out really how to do it. Eno comes up with this idea of, using two microphones and switching between the two so that when Bowie's singing sort of intimately, singing into a microphone that's really close up, and then when he's sort of belting it out, they cut to a microphone farther away so that you get a sense of space changing too. But then also, calls up Robert Fripp and says, "Are you busy?" And Fripp says no, and he flies down and then just makes up one of the best guitar parts ever, right? And so, I think those albums he did with Eno are albums where Bowie didn't get to do exactly what he wanted to do, right? Where he had to work with other people, in ways, which is weird because Eno's good at that and also not good at that, especially back then, right? I mean, his best album that his most important album maybe is Another Green World, which if you haven't heard, you need to, because he brings together Robert Fripp and Phil Manzanera and Phil Collins back when he was just the drummer for Genesis, and some fantastic musicians. I think is it Bill Bruford on bass, maybe? No, it's what's his name with Brand X? Brilliant. Percy Jones on bass. And he brings all these musicians together. Well, not together. He has them play separately. He records them all separately. They have no idea what they're participating in. And then on his own, he puts the songs together. And so I think the first time Percy Jones ever heard the album was when it was done. And he's like, oh, that's what I was doing. Right, so a real sort of painterly approach, and always said this, right? He has a painterly approach to music, where he had all of this material, and then he put it together, given with what he had. To get back to your question, that's what I find interesting about field recording. It's not that, I like recording sounds and then figuring out what I can do with them, right? What else I can make out of them, but I don't ever have an idea about what that's going to be until I start messing with them and seeing what they sound like, time stretched or cut up in different ways or whatever. And then it's like, oh, this is the material I have. What can I make out of that, and what works?
So kind of like sculpting then with raw materials.
Yeah. But again with sound and I mean, it's not until we have digital recording that's easy to do. I listened to I've forgotten the name of it, that first Nurse with Wound album, and I can't imagine how he made that with magnetic tape and cutting up, and it's astonishing. I just can't imagine the sort of physical work that involves. And John Cage had a piece where he cut up and he had exactly one piece because the work that was involved was impossible.
Well, then you have stuff like, Paul's Boutique predates digital, and they were recording. I mean, I would guess that it would be that they were still recording on magnetic tape at that point. But I mean, they were really cutting samples live, and just an incredible amount of them. You know, I mean, it's not, cutting and pasting tape,
right?
But still, any of that kind of collage.
I mean, at least they had tracks, right? At least they didn't have to.
Instead of cutting on one piece of magnetic tape, you it's like 8 or 16. Actually, by the time they did that, I'm sure they were running on like 64.
The recent release of a re-release of Sgt. Pepper's, they had the original, all of the parts, and so they could go through, and apparently they didn't have to do the
remaster.
Well, they remastered, but it's stupid. I know this word. It's a word I use all the time. I wonder what Freud would say.
Well, you were talking about Bowie. If I can just ask maybe a little bit of a silly question. So then, what the hell happened with Dancing in the Streets? I mean,
I can only
you got these genius artists,
and
then you come up with it. I can just too much cocaine, I would guess.
Well, it's a cover, right? So it's not even their own song. I don't know. I can give you Todd Haynes' answer, right? I go watch Velvet Goldmine, and
what do you think about Velvet Goldmine?
I love Velvet
Goldmine. It's so good.
Yeah.
I was thinking that because it crosses some interesting. I've always thought it was interesting that they crossed glam with like the proto grunge.
Is that the sort of fake bio where it's sort of
Bowie and Iggy Pop,
Brian Ferry and
Brian Ferry. There's a Brian Ferry character in it,
and then but Kurt Cobain. It's not. I mean, Ewan McGregor basically plays like a glam version.
Yeah, he plays Iggy Pop, which is in some ways a glam version of Kurt Cobain.
For sure, yeah. But I mean, maybe it's just because I'm generational. I never saw it as Iggy Pop, but I obviously see that that's what it is. But I mean, I came of age when like Nevermind came out,
right?
So I mean, when I watched it, I was like, oh, that's Kurt Cobain, and I just thought it was this, and it's so. Look, Kurt Cobain is Iggy Pop for another generation. Sure, it's raw, and
in some ways. Well, never mind. I was going to say something dark. I'm not going to. That's absolutely true. It's funny because I guess I was in college when Nevermind came out, and I'd heard them before. I was stupid and didn't appreciate them until later. I appreciated them. They weren't my favorite, but I was dumb about music. So, I came of age. I was a teenager in the 80s, so it was post-punk and new wave stuff. A lot of maybe some California punk, but also a lot of Talking Heads and a lot of goth stuff, and that's what I liked. And then college was all about discovering the roots of that stuff in the 70s. Right. So there was glam, but also prog rock, and not Pink Floyd, King Crimson, right? It was so. I wasn't paying attention to popular music at that point, so I remember standing outside the door at Trees in Dallas, and Radiohead was inside. I didn't have any money, so I couldn't go in, and they were playing that Creep song. I was like, oh yeah, that's that band that was never going to do anything. So that's my. I'm not great at picking the hits.
Well, so since that was your kind of, you said, okay, like you saw Talking Heads was happening when you were coming of age, right? Yeah. So
late, right? I mean, because they were big in the 70s and then continued to be big in the 80s, but it wasn't like I was in on the ground floor.
Right, but I mean, like I was wondering what you think now about this. I mean, everything generation returns back. But there's this huge return back to the pop sensibilities that were happening. And I'm talking about like song structure and oral quality. All these things are really going back to like, and I mean like 80s style pop, like Talking Heads, not B-52s.
Right.
You know what I mean? But
no, B-52s too.
I mean, there's a little bit of everything going on. But I see Talking Heads in so many things right now.
No, I think part of that...
Early stuff too, not like later, because I love later, Cuban David Byrne stuff.
Yeah. I saw him on that tour.
Oh, God. That's one of my favorite records.
I'll tell you that story. One of the, like a religious experience I had at that concert later. But I agree with you. I mean, my favorite album of theirs is Remain in Light. Brian Eno produced it. Yeah, I think part of it is because, and this is a digital answer in this case, like all kinds of music are available now, right? So that everything now is contemporary music. There isn't like, it was really difficult for me to find the kind of music I discovered that I liked when I was in high school, and the only reason I discovered that music was that I was, growing up in West Texas. It was pretty isolated, but there was an Air Force base, and so there were kids from the East Coast and the West Coast coming in, and they had vinyl, and then they would record them on cassette. So if cassettes hadn't been around, I wouldn't have gotten to listen to this music too. And usually it was low quality, but I had no idea what these were supposed to sound like. So they sounded like they were supposed to, as far as I knew. And so I'd have, there were albums that are stuck together in my head because they were on different sides of the same cassette, right? So the Smiths' Hatful of Hollow and The Cure's Head on the Door are the same album in my mind because they were on the same cassette that I had. Bauhaus and Joy Division were together, right, on my cassettes, and you cherish those, and you exchange those, and you had copies of copies of copies. But now I can find anything I want, and so, I mean, the hardest thing now is, in some ways, discovery, right, curating, because I don't know what to look for anymore, and so I have to find people whose tastes I trust.
Yep, it seems like that's the hipster prestige of obscurity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but everything can be obscure now, right? Or not, right? It's just obscure until it isn't, because I can really get anything. I just have to know where to look. Bandcamp's great for that, right? Because now anyone can put music up for sale really, really easily. I mean, there's almost no barrier to entry.
It's interesting that the new kind of critical stars are, because there is I think a problem with way too much choice, and even when you give up your choice to like Spotify or Bandcamp or Pandora or 8-Tracks, just random playlist, you're kind of like, okay, I don't want to have to like go spend 30 minutes thinking about what I want to listen to, and I'll listen to anything and let it do it for me. They still play the same things because their algorithms are kind of locked, and even if it gradually incorporates, it's still going to be the same kind of stuff. So then you got these micro blogs, these indie blogs. That's where people kind of like Gorilla vs. Bear, which is local, right out of Dallas, and they are amazing.
Right.
And going to places like that to find, new music and I don't know. It's fascinating the way that things have kind of turned back, and the way that people used to read Rolling Stone.
Right.
And then people
also made
TV,
zines,
and now it's,
right? And people also released zines, and you would find sort of local information, but also national or international stuff through that. I mean, you have to find people who you trust, right? I listen to a lot of Last FM, if you know that online radio station, or not Last FM, I'm sorry. Soma FM out of San Francisco, because they have DJs who, have a kind of breadth of knowledge, but also a depth, and they'll put together they'll program. The programs they put together are put together by a person who intuits things that maybe algorithms have a difficulty intuiting, at least so far. And so even if it's not something I necessarily like, it's always something I can appreciate. And there are various stations. There's a drone station that I like to sort of work to, but also sleep to, which is maybe not a good idea to do both to the same. But there's a new music, experimental music, sort of spanning the history of experimental music station. But there's also a really good jazz station and a really good 80s pop station. And again, those people know what they're doing, I think. And so I've discovered a lot through that. But yeah, I mean, sure, there's too much choice, but that's almost like not having a choice, right? You can kind of get frozen with that. Yeah. Sometimes it's weird to say, but sometimes you just need to be told what to listen to, which was like watching MTV in the old days, right? I would stay up late and watch on Sunday nights 120 Minutes, which was where all the weird music was. Yeah. Weird music videos. And Some of it I liked, some of it I didn't, but at least it wasn't the stuff that was normally there. Yeah. But to get back to this idea of the archive of every kind of music being available, and part of what happens with that too is remastering under not just with current technology, but with current tastes, right? So, and I'm not going to complain about that because it does make everything available, things that would never have been available otherwise. That's, I think, a good thing, and people get to experience music that they hadn't experienced before. But it also means that you could hear someone who's working out of the Talking Heads tradition and Talking Heads, and they're the same, right? There's a kind of flattening that happens so that all music is contemporary music, right? Everything is new. Which makes it even increasingly hard to sort of break through, I think, probably for some bands, because they're not just competing with people who are producing music now, but they're competing with Elvis.
Well, and not just Elvis; it's competing with other artists taking Elvis and remaking it too. So, and not just like the idea of covers, or not even like remixing,
right,
or sampling. You get this thing like vaporwave and stuff like that, which is essentially taking a song that's already existed, kind of cutting it a little bit, but like changing the tempo and the.
My 12-year-old son is way into vaporwave,
yeah,
and it's the only reason I know anything about it. He's like, Dad,
but he has no idea he's listening to Tina Turner.
Yeah,
like.
right, and so he's showing me videos because he also does everything through YouTube.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So
the Simpsons wave.
And he loves it. And what's great is I can appreciate it too. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's before vaporwave, it was Electroclash, which was also sort of participating from the '80s, but sort of maybe ahead of the curve a little bit.
Well, there's I remember electro swing was kind of big for a while, and it was like really bouncy. Almost like disco-y bouncy, but it was like old school swing music, a big band, but they would like electrify it.
And I mean, it's always that, right? I mean, it's hard to it's hard to resist that old man response that we used to, that's just it's not different. It's just what we've all, it's the kind of stuff we used to listen to. It's just a bad imitation of whatever my music was a bad imitation of, right? I mean, it's not.
I used to be it. I used to have it. I don't even know what it is.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I mean, it's right. I mean, punk. Punk was in the '70s, right? Punk was a response to both disco and to glam, or to prog rock, right? I mean, it's. We don't know what we're doing, and so that makes it better in some ways, and certainly it's there's a whole ethos to it that's really important, but it certainly didn't abandon rock and roll song structure, right? I mean, there's nothing more sort of standard rock and roll than a Ramones song.
Yeah, 145.
It's and that's what made it, I think. In some ways, that's what made it palatable, right? I mean, it was recognizably something, but also different, right? And I guess
because it can't be chaos or not gonna have it
it's going to be difficult to really get into it. It's going to be difficult, and some people will always be into it. This is probably apocryphal, but I just read a tweet the other day. The Glastonbury festival just happened, and someone tweeted, "I kind of hope this is true." That there was a huge round of applause after the Radiohead sound check. They were tuning his guitar, and people thought it was a song. Yeah. And the fact that they can't tell the difference, I think, is wonderful. Yeah. Right. I think because it's music too. He was playing it over the speaker for a crowd. John Cage would be happy, right?
There's that kind of echoes the concert for Bangladesh, where Ravi Shankar did the same thing. Came out and tuned his. You can see it in the movie.
Right.
Tunes his sitar, and then after everybody applauds, says, "Well, if you liked the tuning so much, I hope you like the music."
Right. Well, and it's great, right? Because in some ways they they weren't sure what it was supposed to sound like,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, which is, back like when I was listening to really bad dubbed cassettes of music that, again, as far as I knew, was supposed to sound warped and crackly and everything. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if there's such a thing as music, I guess is the question. To get back to, right, I mean, it's organized sound, or it's just sound we pay attention to, right? Yeah. There's not really a difference between soundscapes and music.
Maybe not.
There's a narrative structure, I guess.
There's a difference between song and soundscape, but maybe not music. Yeah.
There's a narrative structure that or something narrative-like, especially if there are vocals, right, that we expect, and we expect refrains and all of that. But, and certainly there are traditions in orchestral music, but it's why a jazz performance is different every time, and you can listen to the studio sessions for, say, Bitches Brew, and listen to them.
There's still like an untold narrative there, right?
Yeah, but there were also what you start enjoying after you've been through the album. I love the album, right? And I could listen to the released album through right now, and I'd be happy. But when you listen to the sessions, what you start enjoying are the differences, right? It's not the sort of, it's not the similarities, right? You start enjoying how they're different. Maybe that's what we listen to, or listen for, rather, is just difference. And that's why, young people don't recognize the old stuff in their new music, because what you're listening for is the new. Mm-hmm. And old people like me just don't hear it. Our hearing's not as good. See, I hate to say this because there's a lot of new music. I'm not really that bad, but
I went to my first concert with earplugs recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You are old.
That's
it's. I will say this is sad. I was talking about how I don't read novels anymore and listen to them, but the music I like most has no lyrics. It's instrumental, and anytime I listen, most often when I hear new music with lyrics, those lyrics are stupid. Having said that, I'll listen to music that I grew up with
dumb lyrics,
and with dumb lyrics, and it won't register that they're dumb, right? I mean, it's like, that's how I'll sing along. But I think really what I don't want is music that I sing along to, because if I'm singing along to it, I'm not listening to it. Does that make sense? And so if there are no lyrics, then I have to just listen. I can't really participate.
So do you like hip hop, or do you have to listen too much to it? Sorry, that was a loaded question.
Yeah, no. Okay, so I'm again in the 90s. I started looking back, right, and so I missed a lot of 90s hip hop that I've sort of rediscovered or discovered for the first time for myself. And then we've had a lot of those documentaries recently about the birth of hip hop, right, or even that Netflix series, The Get Down, which was canceled after the first season, but that was good enough. The first season told a really sort of pretty version of that, and so I have like a huge appreciation now, especially because the recent documentaries are telling a story I always suspected, but because I didn't live in New York, I had no idea. I had no way of sort of proving of the intersection of punk and hip hop, especially early hip hop. So Grandmaster Flash playing new wave and punk clubs, right out of his neighborhood. I mean, that's where Deborah Harry saw him, apparently through a mutual friend, Fat Five Freddy, introduced them, and then of course she sings
recording the first number one.
Rapture, which I always, because I didn't have a context for it, I always thought was just another example of white appropriation. Right, like in the history of, that's the story of rock and roll,
for sure,
right?
Yeah,
but it wasn't until I actually paid attention that she's actually singing about Grandmaster Flash and giving at least a little bit of credit to that. But it was great. I was, in one recent documentary, Flash is talking about how he could do things in those clubs that he couldn't do at home, because they had no expectations.
Right.
And so he was able to experiment. And I love that, right? Because at the same time, we're getting a great black punk band.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Right.
There's a huge...
Well, and Bad Brains.
Bad Brains, yeah.
But they were coming out of D.C., right? So, separated a little bit. So, yeah, there's this big conversation that I just finally discovered that I don't know enough about to speak very, very knowledgeably over. There's that sort of New York, the late 90s, early 2000s, sort of New York art kid hip-hop anti-pop consortium.
Yeah.
Those guys, right? Which reminds me a lot of the late 60s into the 70s art school kids who entered into glam in Prague, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, David Bowie, Brian Eno, and to a certain extent David Byrne, right? All coming out of art school and going into music. So it seems to, in some ways.
I think the trend's still alive too. I mean, there's could be wrong about this, but I think like Broken Social Scene, and then out of that Feist, and like
right.
They all came out of I think somewhere in Canada.
Yeah,
art school. I know. Do you know Grimes?
Sure.
Claire Boucher. She's straight out of art school.
Yeah, and
I love. Yeah. Do you know Grimes?
I don't.
She's makes pop music.
Yeah,
I mean,
but good pop music.
And it's not even pop music you hear on the radio. It's like club pop music, and it's phenomenal. But also, she's also like perfectly weird and strange. Very art school weird.
Yeah, we were listening. I was taking my daughter to camp this morning, and we were listening to. Do you know Laurel Halo? Mm-hmm. Oh, she's fantastic, and again, making things I couldn't make. She has an ear and the kind of ability that is sort of beautiful and astonishing. Her latest album's great. All of her albums are great. I really recommend Laurel Halo. And also there's a guitarist that I found on Bandcamp that I sort of bought everything of hers. Noveler is what she goes under. Noveller. Like I guess someone who writes a novel would be a noveler. Sarah Lipstate, I think is her name, and she, at least to begin with, her latest album is there's more instrumentation, but for a lot of her work, it's sort of participating in the old Frippertronics, Robert Fripp, laying down guitar loops and building on those, and it's really beautiful work. I really like that too. But again, these are people I wouldn't have discovered, except that I think Warren Ellis, the comic book writer, mentioned them in a blog post or his newsletter or something. I was like, oh, listen to this. Yeah. So again, someone you have to trust. Yeah. He did. Ellis was also doing a music podcast for a while. That was just you can find them on iTunes, but he mostly music that. From independent artists where he didn't have to pay royalties or anything, right? And he would put them together and just send them out to introduce those people. So people would say
they're probably appreciative of it.
Yeah, and it's fantastic stuff. Again, someone I trust in pretty much everything. We're about the same age, so I think his tastes are at least grew up around the same time as mine.
So you mentioned you had a story about Talking Heads on tour.
Yeah,
and that might be a good thing to conclude with here.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So it was the Raymond tour. David Byrne was touring with a full brass section, right? Mm-hmm. And I was in college at North Texas at the time, and it was at Fair Park Bandshell, right? And I got there really early, and there were no assigned seats, right? So I was just right in the front. It was me and then this little low fence and a little grassy area and the stage. And I just parked myself there. And he starts playing. And the entire time, we could see back behind the stage, there were dark clouds coming in and some lightning. And we were just like, well, screw it. If it rains, it rains. We're going to stay here. This is too important. And so about halfway through, I think David Byrne jumped off the stage onto the grassy area and then turned his back to me, right? His back is just right to me, and he starts playing the guitar intro to Burning Down the House, right?
Oh, wow, yeah.
And then right at the sort of down, right at the drop, this like huge gusts of wind started blowing through. Bits of the stage were flying off. The sheet music for the brass section went everywhere. Lightning was flashing around. It was like, God gave us a stage show, right? A light show for this. And everyone on the stage is just beaming and laughing. And David Byrne he's singing, but he also has the biggest grin on his face. And it was just like everything was perfect for a moment. Yeah. And it never rained. After the song, all of it calmed down, and it was just perfect, right? Wow. And so, as much as digital music, I guess, is nice, and it's nice that everything's really portable, there's also something about being there.
Yeah,
I guess is the point.
Oh man, that's fantastic.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite moments ever.
Awesome. Well, thanks for
thank you.
Joining us today.
Hope I made sense.
Stop making sense.
Yeah, stop making sense. There we go.
All right. Well, this has been Grad Lads. Thanks for